You ever spend your whole life giving everything to your children? Time, love, money, sacrifices no one ever saw, and then one day, they look you in the eye and say, "You were a terrible parent." That's the moment you stop breathing for a second, like someone knocked the wind right out of you. Not because it's true, but because it's so far from the truth that it leaves you questioning everything. And before we go any further, let me ask you, watching right now, have you ever been blamed for something you know you didn't do by the very people you did it all for? If so, this story will hit you right in the heart. And if you're wondering what kind of person ends up adopting their kids' rivals just to prove a point, buckle up. You're about to get the answer you came here for. And by the time you hear how this ends, you may find yourself questioning who the real villains in this story are. Let's not waste time with small talk because I know what you're thinking. What kind of parent adopts their children's enemies out of revenge? But hold that thought. It's not revenge. Not really. It's something deeper, colder, more calculated, and far more satisfying. This isn't just a petty feud between parents and kids. This is about respect, about dignity, and about sending a message so powerful it echoes through every corner of a small town and into the very halls where those kids once rolled their eyes at me like I was nothing more than a background character in their story. Well, guess what? I became the main character. And this is my origin story. Now, I want you to imagine something with me. You're in your late 50s. You worked your whole life, did the carpool runs, skipped vacations to pay for braces and college funds. You let your dreams rust in the attic so your kids could live theirs. You were the one up at 3 a.m. when they had fevers, the one taking side jobs when bills piled up, the one clapping the loudest from the bleachers even when they didn't look back once. And then, after all that, they grow up and say you never did enough, that you were emotionally unavailable, that you didn't raise them right. And the worst part? They don't say it in private. No. They say it on social media. They tweet it. They post cryptic Instagram stories about healing from toxic parenting. Suddenly, you're trending in the family group chat as public enemy number one. That's exactly what happened to me. I raised two kids, Danielle and Marcus, who now live in cities I helped them move to, in apartments I co-signed the lease for, and they've somehow rewritten our entire family history in their heads. They've decided I was a cold, overbearing, emotionally distant father who never let them be themselves. Never mind the therapy I paid for when Danielle got depressed, or the summer job Marcus wrecked my truck on, and I still covered for. That stuff doesn't matter now. Because now, they've got their own narratives and apparently, I'm the villain in both. You might think I'd try to defend myself, right? Sit them down and talk it out? Nope. Been there, done that. All I got in return was a viral TikTok from Danielle titled 5 Signs You Were Raised by a Narcissist, with a thumbnail that looked a whole lot like me. And here's where it gets interesting. See, I was devastated at first. Genuinely heartbroken. My own children, who once begged me to read them bedtime stories and cried when I left for business trips, now wouldn't even return my calls. But pain, when it sits too long, hardens. It turns into something else. And one day, while sitting alone on a bench in front of our town's community college, watching a group of kids practice for a debate competition, kids from the very high school that used to cheer against mine during football games, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Potential, not in myself. Not anymore. But in them. A group of misfits. Kids with more heart than resources. And that's when the idea sparked. If my own children didn't want my help, my love, or my legacy, maybe someone else did. Now, I know what you're thinking. Asterisk, why they're rivals? Why not just volunteer somewhere or mentor students like a normal retired parent trying to cope with loneliness? Asterisk, because that wouldn't send a message. That wouldn't make anyone sit up in their chair and ask, what the hell just happened? No. If I was going to make a statement, it had to be loud. It had to be unforgettable. So I made a plan. I picked the most overlooked, undersupported kids from the very school district my kids spent years belittling. The ones Danielle called losers with no future, and Marcus said would end up flipping burgers. And I sponsored their futures. I didn't just throw money at them, I mentored them. I guided them. I made them part of my new family. And I made sure Danielle and Marcus saw every single scholarship acceptance, every award ceremony, every campus tour photo. But here's the twist. I didn't just stop at supporting them. I adopted them. Legally. Financially. Publicly. Let that sink in for a second. Now, I'm not going to pretend this was all sunshine and rainbows. These kids had baggage. Trauma. Attitudes. But guess what? So did mine. The difference? These ones listened. These ones wanted to grow. And more importantly, they appreciated it. I never expected the media to pick up on it. I didn't plan to go viral. But once the headline dropped, local father disowned by children adopts their high school rivals for college, it exploded. Suddenly, I was getting calls from morning shows, podcast interviews, even a book deal offer. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that Danielle and Marcus saw it all. And for once, they had nothing clever to say. No hashtags. No snarky comments. Just silence. If you've made it this far in the video, you're probably thinking, Asterisk, did it work? Did his kids finally come back? Do they regret it? Did the adopted kids turn out better than the originals? Asterisk, I'll tell you this. This isn't just a story of revenge. It's a story about finding purpose after betrayal. About realizing that sometimes the family you choose is more loyal than the one you raise. And trust me, it's just getting started. Because what happened next no one saw coming. Not even me. So stick around. Because the twist that flipped this whole story upside down is just a heartbeat away. And once you hear it, you'll never look at parenting or loyalty the same way again. I never expected to be the kind of person people whispered about in grocery store aisles or speculated on in community Facebook threads, but that's exactly who I became. Not because I did anything scandalous. Well, at least not in the traditional sense, but because I made a decision so calculated, so quietly disruptive, it unsettled the very foundation of what people thought they understood about me. After Danielle and Marcus aired our family grievances to the world and labeled me as a toxic parent, I stopped trying to explain myself. Let them have their opinions, I thought. But after weeks turned into months, and their digital shaming turned into real-world consequences, like old friends ignoring my calls or neighbors treating me like I'd committed a crime I didn't even recognize, I realized something had to change. I wasn't just being excluded from family dinners, I was being erased. I started spending more time outside the house, not because I had anywhere specific to go, but because the silence inside had grown loud. The framed graduation photos on the mantel mocked me more than they comforted me, and every room I walked into carried echoes of what once was. It was during one of those long, pointless drives that I stumbled across Lincoln High's community center. I remember the first time I walked in. Dim fluorescent lights, cracked floor tiles, the faint smell of sweat and instant noodles. And yet, there was something alive in that building, something raw and real. Teenagers practicing speeches in a forgotten auditorium, coaches helping kids with college applications on battered laptops, volunteers who looked like they hadn't slept in days. And in the middle of it all, there was this kid, Trayvon. 17. Quiet. Sharp eyes that scanned every word you said like he was decoding it for hidden meaning. I caught him once reading a financial planning book during lunch break, something no teenager had ever voluntarily done in my household. That moment stuck with me. The more I came back, the more I noticed. These kids weren't just underdogs. They were invisible to everyone except each other. No trust funds. No college consultants. Just raw ambition covered in chipped nail polish and thrift store sneakers. One day, I asked Trayvon why he was working so hard. He didn't even blink. He said, "Because I don't get second chances. People like me only get one shot to prove we matter." And that's when it hit me. I was surrounded by a group of kids fighting to prove their worth in a world that was already betting against them. Kids who, in many ways, were everything mine used to be before they forgot where they came from. The more time I spent there, the more personal it became. And I didn't just meet Trayvon. I met Iris, a first-gen Salvadoran American girl who worked 2 jobs just to keep her little brothers fed. I met Gabe, whose father was in prison but still managed a 4.0 GPA. These weren't just faces in a crowd, they were survivors. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing them as strangers and started seeing them as something closer to redemption. But not everything was as straightforward as it seemed. The more I invested emotionally and financially, the more pushback I started getting, not from the kids, but from the adults around them. School officials suddenly became cold. Certain teachers began avoiding eye contact. And then there were the parents, ones who hadn't lifted a finger to help their own children until I came along and started changing the trajectory of their lives. There was tension. Subtle at first, then sharper. Whispers in parking lots. A slashed tire. An unsigned letter on my porch that read, *, these aren't your kids. Stay in your lane. *, I thought about brushing it off, but something in my gut told me this wasn't just about pride or resentment. There was something deeper going on, something these people didn't want me to uncover. And I started to wonder if what I'd walked into was bigger than a simple tale of estranged family ties and second chances. See, while I was building a new kind of family with these kids, strange patterns began to surface. Gabe started missing meetings without explanation. Iris once showed up with bruises she refused to talk about. Trayvon's financial aid paperwork mysteriously disappeared from the counselor's office. At first, I thought I was overreacting, reading too much into coincidences. But I'd been in business long enough to know the difference between bad luck and intentional sabotage. Someone didn't want these kids to rise. And the more I pushed, the more resistance I faced. There were rumors of corruption in the school board, of funds being siphoned away from student programs, of favoritism that punished kids for having ambition outside the approved boundaries. And slowly, a picture began to form, one I didn't yet fully understand, but that chilled me the more it came into focus. I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I'd become a threat to something much bigger than disgruntled teens or bitter school officials. What if my actions had accidentally exposed something systemic? What if the hostility wasn't about my parenting past, but about what I was now enabling these kids to see? People in power don't take kindly to disruption, especially not from someone like me who had nothing left to lose. I had become unpredictable, and in a world built on maintaining silence, that made me dangerous. But as unsettling as the warnings were, I wasn't about to back down. Not when I had already seen the look in Iris's eyes when she got her first acceptance letter. Not when Trayvon hugged me in front of a crowd after winning a state scholarship competition. Not when Gabe said, "You're the only adult who's ever kept a promise to me." But still there were things I hadn't told them. About the real reason I started showing up at that community center. About the message Danielle left on my voicemail 6 months earlier, crying, saying she was sorry, and then abruptly hanging up. About how Marcus had contacted me weeks later asking if he could borrow $10,000 for something he refused to explain. I never answered either of them. Not because I didn't want to, but because for once in my life, I needed to know what it felt like to be chosen, not needed. And yet, I couldn't help but wonder, was their sudden interest just guilt, or something more calculated? Were they circling back because of the media attention? Or because they'd realized too late that the foundation they'd tried to destroy had only grown stronger in their absence? I didn't have the answers. Not yet. But I knew one thing for sure, whatever I had stumbled into, it wasn't over. And if I wanted to protect these new kids, the ones who looked up to me, trusted me, I had to be willing to face whatever came next. Even if it meant tearing open wounds I thought had long since healed. Because in stories like this, the line between savior and suspect is razor thin. And I had a feeling mine was about to get tested in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. So if you're watching and think you've figured this story out, think again. You're only just beginning to see the surface. And the real storm? It's still on the horizon. Just when I thought I had begun to understand the real stakes, when the pieces were slowly starting to form some kind of pattern, the ground shifted beneath me. It started subtly, with one of the college recommendation letters I'd written for Iris suddenly being flagged as incomplete by the admissions board. I knew I'd sent it. I double-checked the email records. It had been received, time-stamped, even confirmed by an automated reply. But now it had vanished from their system entirely. At first, I chalked it up to a tech glitch. Universities are swamped during admission season. Mistakes happen. But then Trayvon's scholarship packet, the one he and I spent weeks organizing and submitting, got returned in the mail with a red stamp that read, "Ineligible. Documents altered." That word, *altered*, hit me hard. Because I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that no one had altered anything, unless someone wanted to make it look like we had. And that's when the fear started to creep in, not for me, but for them. For these kids who had worked so damn hard just to earn a sliver of opportunity. I tried calling the offices, tried resubmitting the paperwork, but everywhere I turned, doors that were once wide open began slamming shut. People who had been polite before suddenly acted like I was asking for favors I didn't deserve. I couldn't prove it, but I could feel it. Someone was actively working to sabotage these kids. Someone who didn't want them moving forward. And the more I pushed to uncover the truth, the clearer it became that I was stepping into territory people didn't want me anywhere near. Then came the first real warning, direct, unsettling, and personal. I had just gotten home from a long meeting with Gabe and his part-time employer to help document his work history for a special grant. The house was quiet, like always, but something felt off. The kind of quiet that doesn't settle. It stares back at you. When I walked into the kitchen, I found a manila envelope on my counter. No postage. No name. Just 3 sheets of paper inside, all blank, except for one line in the center of the last page. Asterisk, stop looking into the past if you want them to have a future. Asterisk, my first instinct was to assume it was a prank, maybe some misguided warning from one of the kids' relatives who didn't like my involvement. But the handwriting was shaky. The pressure uneven. It felt desperate. Unstable. And it told me something I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet. Whatever this was, it was bigger than just a few academic sabotage attempts. I wasn't the first person to ask questions. I was just the first one who wouldn't let go. As I tried to figure out who might be behind it, I made the mistake of trusting someone I shouldn't have. There was a teacher, Mrs. Calderon. Middle-aged, sharp-tongued, but passionate about the kids. She'd always gone out of her way to thank me for my involvement, even invited me to a few after-school events as a guest mentor. We'd had coffee once or twice, nothing serious, just conversation about the education system and how the district was failing kids like Trayvon and Iris. I confided in her about the missing documents, about the strange warning, about how everything was starting to feel like a bad thriller novel. She listened closely, too closely, and then she vanished, stopped returning my calls. Her classroom door was locked when I dropped by unannounced. When I asked one of the students about her, they said she'd taken emergency leave. No explanation. Just gone. I later found out that her personnel file had been sealed, something that only happens when internal investigations are underway. But no one would say what kind. And suddenly, the one person I thought might have answers had been scrubbed from the equation entirely. It was around this time that I found myself digging deeper, not into the present, but into something that happened years ago. An old newspaper article, yellowed with age, folded and half-buried in a forgotten drawer at the community center. The headline read, Asterisk, Lincoln High Principal Resigns Amid Missing Funds Controversy. Asterisk, it was dated 13 years earlier. I barely noticed it at first, until I saw the name of the principal. Asterisk, Nathaniel Black. Asterisk, that name had come up in passing during one of Trayvon's rants about unfair grading policies. But what really struck me was the photo. In the corner, standing beside a younger Nathaniel Black, was a man I recognized instantly. Marcus, my son, 17 at the time, wearing a volunteer badge, smiling, looking proud. My stomach dropped. Suddenly, everything I thought I understood about this town, this school, these kids, it all changed. What was my son doing tied to a financial scandal from over a decade ago? He never mentioned any of it. Was it coincidence? Or was that voicemail he left me, the one I ignored, about more than just guilt? And if Marcus was involved in something back then, how deep did it go? I started to wonder if I'd misjudged the situation entirely. Maybe the betrayal I felt for my kids wasn't just emotional. Maybe there were secrets buried in their past that someone was willing to go to dangerous lengths to keep hidden. And that's when the second envelope arrived. No words this time. Just a photo, blurry but unmistakable. It was Iris, standing alone at a bus stop. Taken at night, from a distance. Folded behind it was a scrap of paper that read, Asterisk, last chance. Asterisk. I stared at it for a long time, my pulse racing with fear and fury. This was no longer just about me proving I was a good father. This was about protecting the only people who still saw me that way. And someone out there was warning me to stay quiet. But I'd come too far to stop now. Because behind the headlines, behind the betrayal, behind the lost files and sealed records, there was a truth someone was desperate to bury. And I was getting closer to digging it up. What I didn't know was that the person closest to me, the one I still trusted, was the one holding the last missing piece. And when I finally uncovered what they were hiding, everything would change. But that's a story for the next chapter. And once you hear it, you'll understand why some truths are kept buried for a reason. It was the kind of night where everything feels too still, like the air itself is holding its breath. I hadn't slept well in weeks. Ever since the second envelope with Iris's photo arrived, I'd been pacing through my house like a ghost, checking locks, watching shadows, rereading old messages from my kids, trying to piece together a timeline that never seemed to line up the same way twice. I kept telling myself this was all just the result of stirring up things that were better left untouched. But that photo, that was personal. That was a threat. Not just to me, but to a girl who didn't ask for any of this. Someone out there had crossed a line, and if I didn't figure out who, something terrible was going to happen. Then came the twist I never expected. Someone else got dragged in. Linda, my late wife's sister. We'd lost touch after the fallout with Danielle and Marcus. She'd always tried to stay neutral, even when my kids started turning their backs on me. She said she didn't want to choose sides, that families go through hard seasons and heal in their own time. I respected her for that, even when it hurt. But that morning I got a call from her, no greeting, no small talk. Just 3 sharp words. Did you send this? I drove to her house immediately, heart pounding in a way I hadn't felt since the day I watched my daughter walk away without saying goodbye. She met me on the porch, visibly shaken, holding a white envelope in her hand. I didn't need to open it, I already knew what was inside. She handed it to me anyway, and sure enough, it was nearly identical to mine. Blank sheets of paper, one line scrawled in the same handwriting. Asterisk, you're too close. This isn't your fight. Asterisk, the only difference? There was no photo. Instead, a flash drive had been taped inside the envelope. I took it back to my place and plugged it in with shaking hands, expecting a virus or some distorted video threat. But what I found was even worse, a set of scanned documents, old but clearly official. Bank records, property transfers, names I hadn't seen in years. And one name that stopped me cold. Danielle Foster, my daughter. Signed as a secondary beneficiary on a private scholarship fund that had mysteriously dried up years ago. A fund I had donated to under anonymity when she was still in high school. The implication hit me like a gut punch. Either she had somehow gained access to that money after the original records were altered, or someone had funneled it to her without my knowledge. And if that were true, it meant everything. The social media rants, the public disowning, the viral videos calling me a narcissistic failure of a father, could have been a calculated act to cover up something much uglier.
But why?
Why would Danielle turn something so personal into performance unless she was hiding a much bigger secret? I didn't want to believe it. Part of me still wanted to think that she was just hurt, confused, caught up in some self-help echo chamber that turned good parenting into trauma for clicks. But this wasn't just emotional backlash anymore. This was money, power, cover-ups. And suddenly, I had to ask myself a question I never thought I'd have to consider. Asterisk, what if my own daughter had been involved in this from the very beginning? Asterisk. As the days passed, the atmosphere around me grew more hostile. Calls I didn't remember making showed up in my phone logs. Emails I never sent were forwarded back to me by confused college contacts, asking if I still planned to withdraw support. Gabe stopped showing up altogether, and when I finally reached him through a burner phone number he gave me in case of emergencies, all he said was, "I can't talk. They're watching." Then he hung up. The next time I drove by the community center, it was closed. A padlock had been slapped on the front gate, and a handwritten sign read, "Maintenance, closed until further notice." But I knew better. This wasn't maintenance. This was lockdown. Silence. A warning to anyone who was getting too loud. It was Linda who broke the silence again. She called me 2 nights later, her voice lower, shakier than before. She said someone had broken into her garage. Nothing was stolen. No mess. But they left something. One of Danielle's old trophies, placed neatly on the hood of Linda's car. As if to say, asterisk, we know who you are. We know where your loyalties lie. Asterisk, I could hear the fear in her voice, and it terrified me too, not just because of the message, but because it suggested something I hadn't yet dared to say out loud. This wasn't just some petty sabotage attempt from an angry parent or an old school grudge. This was organized, coordinated, intentional. Someone was orchestrating every move, and I had no idea who was pulling the strings. That's when I remembered Mrs. Calderon, the teacher who vanished after I confided in her. I started digging through old-school newsletters, staff directories, any mention I could find of her. Then I saw a small blurb in a digital district memo that mentioned she'd transferred to a charter school 2 towns over. But that wasn't the surprise. The surprise was who signed the transfer paperwork. Asterisk Nathaniel Black. Asterisk the same former principal whose name had shown up in that scandal a decade ago, who had supposedly resigned in disgrace. Now listed as a consultant for the new charter school. Somehow he was back. Quietly, behind the scenes, operating under a title that let him move without scrutiny. The more I pulled, the more tangled the threads became. Names that should have had no connection to one another were now popping up together in donor lists, anonymous board members, alumni foundations tied to shadow scholarships. It wasn't just Danielle. It wasn't just Marcus. This was systemic, deep, and rooted in relationships that went back far earlier than I thought. Which meant the betrayal I felt from my children might have just been one piece of a puzzle I hadn't fully assembled yet. Or maybe I was the only one who didn't realize I was being used all along. But the real twist, the one I never saw coming, happened when I got a knock on my door just before midnight. It wasn't a stranger. It was Trayvon. Pale, shaking, bleeding slightly from a gash above his eyebrow. He didn't say anything for a long time. Just stood there, breathing like he'd run 10 miles. Then he looked at me, eyes filled with something between fear and betrayal, and said, I didn't know what they were doing until I saw the files. I think I've been helping the wrong side this whole time. Before I could ask what he meant, headlights appeared behind him, slow, quiet, deliberate, and Trayvon stepped back, whispering, They followed me here. And just like that, everything I thought I understood collapsed in on itself. Because if Trayvon had been a pawn in someone else's game, then who else had I trusted who wasn't on my side? And more importantly, who was? I don't remember locking the front door that night, but I remember hearing it click behind me, the sound sharp and final, like a sentence being handed down. Trayvon sat at my kitchen table, shivering under a borrowed hoodie, dried blood crusted along the side of his face. I wanted to ask questions, demand answers, but something about the way he stared at the floor told me he wasn't ready to speak, and maybe I wasn't ready to hear what he had to say. Outside, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. There were no crickets, no passing cars, not even the faint hum of neighborhood life. Just that eerie stillness again, pressing in around the house like a held breath. And deep down, something primal in me stirred, the instinct that something was watching. I moved to close the curtains, and that's when I saw it. Parked just down the block, partially hidden under the shade of a large maple tree, was a dark SUV. The headlights were off, engine running. It hadn't been there earlier, I would have noticed. I'm not a paranoid man by nature. I never bought into conspiracy theories or cloak-and-dagger nonsense. But lately, reality had been pulling me closer to a version of the world where shadows weren't just empty space. They were hiding places. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the SUV, daring it to move. It didn't. Just sat there like a spider in a web, patient and still. When I turned back to Trayvon, he looked up at me with hollow eyes and said quietly, They know I told you. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of it dropped through the room like a stone in water. I asked him who they were, but he just shook his head. Said if he gave names, they'd come for him first. I could see it in his body. This wasn't the same sharp, hopeful kid I'd met at the community center. Something in him had fractured. He told me that he'd been offered a job months ago, some generic internship with a local education nonprofit that turned out to be a shell organization. His role, he said, was to gather data. Not for students, but for someone pulling strings from the top. They wanted access to school records, psychological evaluations, even disciplinary reports. Anything that could be used as leverage, or maybe blackmail. At first, Trayvon thought he was helping build a scholarship database. Then the files started disappearing. Kids got kicked off programs without reason. And when he tried to back out, someone left a note in his locker with a single word written in red marker, traitor. That was the first time he got jumped. He never reported it, told the school he slipped on wet pavement. But the beatings didn't stop. And neither did the pressure. That's why he disappeared, why he ghosted everyone.
He didn't want me involved.
Said they'd already flagged me the moment I started signing college forms and asking questions. The truth was, Trayvon didn't come to my door for safety. He came because he knew he was already in too deep. He just didn't want to die alone. I sat in that room with him for hours, and somewhere around 3 a.m., I dozed off in the chair across from him. When I woke up, he was gone. His hoodie folded neatly on the couch. My front door unlocked. The SUV down the block was gone too. No note. No text. Nothing. Just absence. Cold and wide. I called him, left voicemails, checked local hospitals. No one had seen him. It was as if he'd vanished. Or been made to vanish. And that was when I started to unravel. Paranoia isn't something that hits you all at once. It creeps in slowly, infecting ordinary things. A car behind you on the highway feels like it's following too close. A man browsing the same aisle at the grocery store glances one too many times. A neighbor you've known for a decade suddenly stops waving back. You start seeing patterns that may not be there, but what if they are? What if everything you thought was a coincidence is part of the same design? That's where I found myself. I couldn't trust anyone. Not the people in town. Not the teachers. Not even the records I was using to try and piece the story together. One morning I logged into my email and every file I'd saved, every forwarded message, every attachment, all of it gone. Not deleted. Just wiped. As if they'd never existed. The recovery software said the data had been erased, manually. But I never gave anyone else my passwords. Then came the news about Linda. She didn't answer my calls for 3 days. I figured she needed space. She'd been scared, rattled by the envelope, and maybe she was pulling back to protect herself. I drove by her house and found her front door wide open. The lights were on. Her phone on the kitchen table. Her car in the driveway. But she wasn't there. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, no blood. Just emptiness. The kind that sets your teeth on edge. I reported it, of course. The local police took my statement, asked the usual questions, but something in their tone told me they didn't buy the urgency. They called it a non-critical adult absence. Said she was probably just getting some air. They didn't see the connection. Or maybe they didn't want to. The next night, someone broke into my garage. Nothing was stolen again. Just a small plastic box left in the center of the floor. Inside, a thumb drive. I almost didn't open it. Thought it might be another bluff. But curiosity outweighed fear. On the drive was a single video file, grainy and dark. The camera was fixed like a hidden security feed. At first, it just showed an empty hallway. Then a figure appeared. A woman. Dressed like Linda. Carrying a folder. She paused at a door, looked around nervously, and slipped inside. 10 minutes later, 2 men in dark jackets followed. The footage ended there. I sat staring at the screen long after the video stopped playing. I didn't know what to feel. Panic, rage, grief. Was that the last time anyone saw her? Who filmed it? Why send it to me? To scare me? Or to warn me? I felt the walls closing in after that. Every movement outside my window sent a jolt through me. I stopped answering unknown calls. Stopped going into town. Started keeping a baseball bat by the front door, even though I knew that if they came, it wouldn't matter. I was up against something too big, too organized. I'd stumbled into a game where I didn't even know the rules. And worst of all, I didn't know who else might be playing. What kept me going was a single question. Asterisk, why now? Asterisk, why were these threats intensifying? Why were people disappearing, evidence vanishing, truths twisting into shadows? I knew I was close to something. Something that had been buried for years. A truth so ugly it was worth threatening a girl like Iris, worth scaring Trayvon into silence, worth silencing Linda altogether. And then, just as I was about to give up, an anonymous letter arrived. No return address. Just one line handwritten on the back of an old school directory. Asterisk, you're looking in the wrong place. It didn't start with your kids, it started with you. Asterisk. I stared at those words for hours. Because if I was the beginning, then maybe I wasn't just the hunter in this mystery. Maybe I was the bait. I held that letter in my hands like it was radioactive, my fingers trembling as my mind tried to comprehend what it was really saying. Asterisk, it didn't start with your kids, it started with you. Asterisk, the words hit like a slap, because up until that moment, I had framed this entire story around my children, Danielle and Marcus. Their betrayal, their rejection, their supposed lies. I had convinced myself that this whole twisted path I was walking had started the day they turned against me, but this message was something different. It was a shift in the wind, a whispered suggestion that maybe I wasn't chasing a mystery, I was standing in the center of it. That realization clawed at my chest, scraping up memories I hadn't touched in years. Things I'd buried deep under decades of work, family, and silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk for hours, pulling out old tax files, property records, donation slips, anything that could give me a timeline. Something I could use to anchor myself. That's when I found a folder buried beneath stacks of unrelated paperwork. It was a set of financial records from over 15 years ago, around the time Danielle was starting high school. At first glance, they looked like routine documents, college savings plans, charitable donations, volunteer expenses. But as I flipped through them, I noticed something that didn't sit right. Multiple checks, made out in my name, to organizations I had no memory of donating to. The amounts were large, some in the tens of thousands. One name appeared repeatedly on the transaction list, Better Future Foundation. I racked my brain, trying to remember if it had been one of the nonprofits we'd worked with through the school. I even pulled up my old email threads to see if I'd ever communicated with anyone affiliated. Nothing. No records. No website. It was as if the foundation had never existed. I thought maybe I was losing my mind, until I made one last call to an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Raymond Ellis, a former school board treasurer and someone who used to sit on the same fundraising committees as I did back when my kids were still in school. We hadn't parted on the best terms after a disagreement over mismanaged funds. But when he picked up the phone and heard my name, he didn't hesitate. He didn't ask how I was. Didn't pretend to be surprised. He just said, I was wondering how long it would take before you figured it out. That was the moment the bottom dropped out. Raymond told me the Better Future Foundation had been a ghost entity, a financial front created during a major education grant campaign over a decade ago. Dozens of well-meaning parents, myself included, had been targeted by a select few members of the district's upper circle. We thought we were making generous, tax-deductible donations to improve underfunded programs. But behind the scenes, those funds were being rerouted into private accounts, backdoor real estate investments, and illegal scholarships for children of board members and select families. My name had been used as a funnel, someone with a clean record and no suspicion. They chose me because I was seen as safe, naive, and too proud to ask too many questions. I hadn't just stumbled into the conspiracy. I had unknowingly helped build it. And that's why everything started falling apart the moment I tried to reconnect with the school district and uplift kids like Trayvon and Iris. Because when I stepped back into that world, I triggered old security systems designed to protect the secrets of people who'd spent years erasing the past. It wasn't about revenge for my children. It wasn't about petty school drama or misunderstood parenting. This was about legacy. About protecting a decades-long cover-up that had made powerful people rich and left countless students behind. And someone somewhere knew I was finally seeing it. But that wasn't the worst of it. Raymond confessed one last thing before hanging up. He said there was a reason my kids had turned on me so publicly. That viral post Danielle made about narcissistic parenting? The explosive tweets from Marcus about emotional manipulation? They weren't random. They were insurance. Public documentation that cast me as unstable, dangerous, someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted. Because if the truth about the financial fraud ever came out and my name was attached to it, they needed a narrative ready, one that painted me as the villain long before the facts could catch up. My own children were used to discredit me in advance. And whether they were willing participants or manipulated themselves, I had no way of knowing. I sat in silence after that call, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The missing files, the slashed tires, the threats, Linda's disappearance, Trayvon's sudden breakdown. It was all part of the same effort to isolate me, destabilize me, and bury the past before I could connect the dots. But the biggest twist wasn't just that I'd been unknowingly involved. It was that someone close to me, someone I still hadn't identified, had to be orchestrating my every move, feeding me just enough information to keep me digging, but never quite enough to expose the full truth. A handler, a watcher, a traitor hiding in plain sight. And that's when it happened. I was about to shut down my laptop when a new email popped up. No sender, no subject, just a single attachment labeled confession. I hesitated, then clicked. It was a video. Grainy footage. A room I recognized instantly, my old office. And in the center of the screen, seated in my chair, was Danielle. Crying. Looking straight into the camera, she said, "If you're watching this, then I couldn't protect you in time. They made me lie. Dad, I'm so sorry." I tried to stop them, and then the screen went black. I stared at the frozen frame, her face blurred by compression, her voice still echoing in my ears. My mind raced with questions. Who was they? Why had she recorded this? Where was she now? And suddenly, everything I thought I understood shattered once again. Because if Danielle had tried to protect me, then the danger wasn't just real. It was already inside my home. The days that followed Danielle's video felt like moving through the eye of a storm, too calm, too quiet, the kind of silence that hums with impending chaos. I replayed her message over and over, analyzing every frame, every word, looking for background details, reflections, anything that could point me toward where she was or who had forced her hand. Her eyes had that same look I remembered from when she was a child, the one she used to give me when she broke something and didn't want to get in trouble. But this time, the fear behind it was real.
Raw.
And it told me she wasn't acting. She hadn't turned against me by choice. She had been cornered. I knew what I had to do, even if every part of me dreaded it. The only way to bring this thing to an end was to walk straight into its heart, and that meant going back to where it all began, the old Lincoln High Board office. It had been shut down years ago, replaced by a newer administration building across town, but I remember hearing whispers that parts of it were still used for private meetings. I arrived just after dusk, parking several blocks away, avoiding street cameras, making sure no one was following me. The building stood like a tomb, lights off, windows covered in film, but a faint glow leaked from beneath a rear service door. I approached slowly, adrenaline pulsing through my veins, hands clammy with nerves. I wasn't a spy. I wasn't built for this. But I was a father, and fathers will burn the world down for their children. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was thick with dust and something else, something metallic and old, like the scent of forgotten truths. The hallways were lined with boxes and rusting filing cabinets. Most rooms were empty, but I followed the light and voices to a corner conference room. That's where I saw them, seated around a long, rectangular table where the very people I once trusted with my money, my time, my children's futures. Board members, former faculty, private donors, and at the head of the table, calm, composed, and sipping tea, was Nathaniel Black. He looked older than his last public photo, but no less dangerous. Sharp suit, unreadable expression, eyes that flicked to mine like a predator sizing up prey. "You've come a long way," he said, as if we were old friends catching up. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Not yet. My eyes scanned the room, noting the security cameras tucked in corners, the the folders stacked beside each chair. They weren't here for a meeting. This was a cover-up in motion. The final sweep before the whole operation disappeared. "You always were the perfect decoy," he said, leaning back. "Respectable, outspoken, a little desperate for validation. We knew if things ever got messy, you'd be the perfect scapegoat." He smiled. "And you didn't disappoint." That was when the panic nearly swallowed me. All this time, I thought I'd been investigating them. But in reality, they'd been guiding me, breadcrumbing just enough truth to keep me occupied, distracted, controlled. Every leak, every threat, every moment of paranoia, they orchestrated it. The goal wasn't just to silence me. It was to discredit me, frame me as the architect of a scheme I barely understood. Then came the final blow. From behind a side door stepped Danielle. But not the Danielle from the video. This version was polished, composed, wearing a gray suit and the expression of someone who had shed too many tears to ever shed another. My mouth went dry. "What is this?" I whispered. She didn't look at me at first. She stared at Nathaniel, then back to the group. "We have everything we need," she said, her voice steady. "All the documentation, all the recordings." Then she turned to me. "It's over, Dad." My knees nearly gave out. For a terrifying moment, I thought she had betrayed me completely, that everything was a performance, that the video had been bait, a setup to drag me here for a final humiliation. But then she opened her briefcase and slid a thick folder across the table. Names, bank records, hidden accounts, a full timeline of the fraud going back 20 years. Nathaniel froze. "This is being live-streamed," Danielle said, pointing to the camera above the door. "To 6 different servers. If anything happens to me or my father tonight, this goes wide. National media, federal investigators, the whole world." A deep, sickening silence settled over the room. Danielle looked at me then, and the truth unraveled in her eyes. "They threatened to ruin you. Said you were already being watched. That no one would believe you. But I found the files, Dad. The ones you forgot you saved. On that old laptop in the attic. I copied them before anyone could wipe them. I've been building this case for months." I couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She had been playing both sides, not betraying me, but protecting me from inside the belly of the beast. Every awful word she said online, every public distancing, it was a smokescreen. So they'd let her in, so she could take them down from within. And it worked. One of the donors at the table lunged for the camera, but it was too late. The feed had already triggered. I could hear sirens outside, distant at first, then growing louder. Nathaniel's calm cracked, his hand trembling as he reached for his coat. "You think this ends with us?" he growled. "You think exposing one layer makes you a hero?" Danielle didn't flinch. "It ends with justice. For every student you stole from, every life you derailed." The doors burst open. Police. FBI. The room exploded into shouts and movement as agents swept in. People resisted. Others wept. I stood in the middle of it, frozen, until a warm hand wrapped around mine, Danielle's. "I never stopped believing in you," she whispered. We stepped outside into the flashing lights, into the swarm of press and law enforcement. Everything we had feared, everything we had suffered, finally coming to a head. But even then, something felt unfinished, like a thread still hanging. It wasn't until we got home, hours later, that I found the envelope on my doorstep. No return address. Inside, a single Polaroid. Trayvon, standing beside a man in a hoodie I didn't recognize, holding today's newspaper. Alive. But on the back, one sentence was scrawled in block letters. "You exposed the puppets. Now, let's talk about the ones holding the strings." And just like that, the game wasn't over. It was just beginning. It's strange how quiet the world feels once the noise fades. After the headlines died down, after the courtrooms emptied and the media frenzy found a new scandal to chase, I stood in my backyard for what felt like the first time in years, listening to the wind move through the trees, really listening. It was the same house my kids had grown up in, the same porch where we carved pumpkins and argued about curfews, The same steps Danielle once stormed down, slamming the door behind her for what I thought would be the last time. But everything was different now because I was different. And because the truth had finally surfaced, dragging everything with it, including me. The investigation took months. Nathaniel Black and his inner circle were charged with fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and a dozen other crimes. Turns out the corruption ran deeper than anyone imagined, spanning multiple states, hidden accounts, and decades of stolen futures. Their downfall made headlines for weeks. Whistleblower blogs picked up the story. A documentary crew even came sniffing around, wanting exclusive interviews. But I wasn't interested in fame or revenge. I just wanted to understand how I let it happen right under my nose. I wanted to know how a man could live an honest life and still be used as a pawn in someone else's game. The hardest part wasn't the lies or the manipulation. It was realizing that I had spent years punishing myself for being a bad father, when in truth, I had been fighting to be a good one in a rigged system. Danielle and I still don't talk about everything that happened. Some wounds don't close just because the bleeding stops. But there's an unspoken understanding between us now, something stronger than forgiveness. She visits often, brings groceries, sits with me in the kitchen like she used to when she was little. Sometimes we laugh. Sometimes we don't need to say a word. Her courage still floors me. The risks she took, the pain she carried, the way she protected me even when I thought she'd abandoned me. I used to think being a good parent meant always being right. Now I know it means being there, even when you're wrong. Especially then. Marcus came back too, quieter than his sister, more cautious. He admitted that he'd believed the worst about me because it was easier than confronting the truth about what others had done. He said he was sorry. I didn't need to hear it, but I'm glad he said it anyway. We're still working through things, but that's what healing looks like sometimes. Not a clean break, but a slow rebuild, brick by uncertain brick. Trayvon returned a month after the arrests. He showed up on my porch just like he had before, only this time he wasn't running. He told me he'd been hiding with help from someone on the inside, someone who didn't agree with what Nathaniel and the others were doing but couldn't risk going public. That person had given him the Polaroid, a warning and a promise rolled into one. Trayvon didn't tell me who they were, and I didn't ask. Some secrets protect people better than the truth ever could. But what mattered was that he was safe. Iris got her scholarship. Gabe graduated with honors. The kids I fought for, the ones who had no reason to believe in me, had a future again. And maybe that's what this was all for. I think the hardest thing to accept is that there will always be shadows. Corruption isn't a villain you defeat in one final scene. It's a shapeshifter, always hiding in new places, wearing new faces. But light has a way of creeping in where it's least expected. That's what I try to focus on now. I spend my mornings volunteering at a new community center. It's not much, but it's honest. I help kids write resumes, practice interviews, figure out FAFSA forms. I don't need to adopt anyone anymore. I just show up, and that's enough. Sometimes they ask about the scandal. Most of the time they don't. They just want someone who listens. Someone who gets it. Still, that last envelope never left my desk. The one with the Polaroid. The message scrawled on the back. Asterisk, you exposed the puppets. Now, let's talk about the ones holding the strings. Asterisk, it haunts me, not because I'm afraid, but because I know it's true. The story I unraveled was only part of something larger, something still pulsing behind the polished doors of nonprofits and school boards and anonymous donors with well-practiced smiles. There are names I never uncovered, connections I couldn't trace. And one day, someone will pick up that thread. Maybe it'll be one of the kids I helped. Maybe it'll be someone who watches the story and sees through the cracks. Or maybe it'll be me one more time. For now, I keep the porch light on. Because after everything, I've learned the world doesn't just need people who shout the truth. It needs the ones who wait in silence, ready to help the next person brave enough to ask the hard questions. If you made it this far, you already know this wasn't just a story about betrayal or revenge. It was about power, legacy, redemption, and the cost of waking up. And if you're wondering whether it could happen in your town, at your school, in your family, it already is. The real question is, what will you do when it finds you? That's where my story ends. Or maybe it's just where yours begins.